Crazy Horse is one of the most important historical figures in Lakota culture. He was known by a few other names when he was younger, but he did die with the name Crazy Horse, which was actually given to him by his father. Crazy Horse was Wakiyan, which means a thunder dreamer, and those are the most powerful dreamers in Lakota understandings. We're going to talk a little bit about his vision that he experienced as a young man and how that guided his life for the rest of his life, and also led to him being not just one of the most important leaders, but one of the best protectors of his people when face to face with the United States military. So the first name that people called him was Jiji, which means light hair in Lakota. He was unusual physically in that his hair was very, very light and curly, and his skin was also lighter than others. So from the very beginning, he stood out as different, and that didn't make it wrong or bad. It was just different than the other kids. He also had a kind of quiet seriousness, according to the stories that we get passed down. Even as a young boy, he would often go off by himself. He sought out older mentors to teach him, and he became very proficient as a young warrior very, very early. When he was a young man and starting to really fine-tune his warrior techniques, the people called him his horse stands in sight for a couple of reasons. Mostly because in the middle of a battle, whether it was against the Pawnee or the Crow, or even against the ever-encroaching settlers who were making their way across the Bozeman Trail right through the Lakota Territory, or in combat with the military, he would often get off of his pony and stop, even though there were bullets and arrows flying all around, and make sure he had great aim when he started to shoot. So very early and very quickly, he became known as an expert warrior, a great shot, and whatever he aimed at, he hit. He really does embody those really important Lakota virtues. I think you can find those uploaded under week 7. They're very important virtues. They're the principles that Lakota people ideally live by. And one of the most important is actually humility. To be humble, to be modest, to be unpretentious. So it was customary when warriors would come back from whatever altercation or battle they had, it was customary for the people to want to hear the stories of their exploits, and oftentimes the the warriors would oblige and really tell, a lot about the exploits and their bravery and counting coup. By the way, counting coup is one of the most respected and admired things that a warrior does in battle, and it doesn't involve killing the enemy. It just means you get close enough to touch them, whether with an arrow or something else, and get away before they can get you. So the bravest warriors were the ones who counted coup the most. But unlike the other warriors, Crazy Horse would not brag about his exploits, even though they outnumbered most of the other men in his community. The people would really try to get him to, and he would just, really kind of pull back and be, very, very hesitant to do that. So he really did display this kind of humbleness and humility. Joseph Marshall III is a Lakota author. He wrote The Lakota Way and The Journey of Crazy Horse, 2 sources from which I drew for this presentation. He talked about Waktoglaka, which is the custom of bragging about wartime exploits. And in his book, he says, quote, "Most men who did the Waktoglaka did not repeat the story unless asked, because they recognized the value of humility." So even for the other warriors, they had to be, really, really encouraged before they would do that. But Crazy Horse, if anyone earned the right to participate in the Waktoglika ceremony, it was Crazy Horse. But according to all the stories handed down about him, he never did. And according to Marshall, for all his life, he was painfully shy, though he was entitled to wear the symbols of his many achievements on the battlefield, including eagle feathers. He was known to dress plainly, and if he wore any decoration, it was a single feather. So those are direct quotes from Joseph Marshall, whose Tioshpaye, or extended network, is a descendant of Crazy Horse, are descendants of Crazy Horse. So Chantayuke is generosity, and the translation for that in Lakota means to have a heart. So generosity and humility are two of the most important principles, continue to be in Lakota culture, and generosity is most seen the most in terms of those individuals or groups within a community who, or Tioshpaye, who are somehow like either widowed or the kids might be orphaned or whatever. So the greatest warriors and the most successful hunters would always take care of those who were needy in the community. So for example, if a hunter came back, a very good hunter with a lot of meat, rather than just keep that for his small network, he made sure that the people that needed it the most were fed first and given what he could give before he turned to his own needs. So that's typical throughout Lakota culture still today, and is also seen in the giveaway, which the giveaway up in this part of the country, the native peoples call it Klukwana, but it's basically like a potlatch or giveaway ceremony. And it coincides with releasing the spirit ceremony. When somebody dies, there's a period of mourning where people come to pay their respects, and at that same time, the people who are mourning and grieving that person also, when the visitors come to their lodge, they offer them food, they offer them what they can, as in terms of hospitality, just a very genuine hospitality. And oftentimes that leaves people in a state of having almost nothing left. But the most important thing is the generous spirit in giving away. And there are some really good stories in the Lakota Way by Joseph Marshall, for example, about an old couple whose son had died, and when the people came to grieve with them, and they gave away what they had in terms of food and possessions and things like that, they were really literally left with nothing. But the next morning, people began to show up and just completely replenish their lodge with what they had given away, so that they were no longer kind of bereft and left without. So the reciprocity and exchange in terms of generosity is an important principle and virtue, and Crazy Horse, certainly as a very successful hunter, was quite generous with everybody and took care of those who needed it most. Wohohitike, I always have trouble with that word, is courage in Lakota, and it's told by Joseph Marshall and others that have written about Crazy Horse. And maybe, I think in that documentary Tashunka Witko, you might have seen that it didn't mean that he wasn't afraid when he was going into battle. Oftentimes afraid, trepidatious, hesitant, but never did he fail to rise to the occasion. So this, I think, is the Fetterman fight, where there were two colonels that were at Fort Kearny and Fort Robinson, and in different times they both were really convinced that they could take out the entire Sioux Nation. Like in the late 1800s, that was becoming more and more a preoccupation of the military. They wanted to open up all those lands for settlers so that they could stake their claims, and they also wanted to help facilitate the railroad, which was going to pass through Lakota traditional land. So Fetterman, Colonel Fetterman was one, and Colonel Grattan was another, whose kind of hubris and pride led to their demise. In the first case, Grattan, that was the story you probably remember about the party of Mormons who were making their way along the Bozeman Trail with a herd of cattle. And one of the cows was sick and had fallen behind. And as they were passing by a Lakota community conquering bears camp, one of the hunters just shot the cow and brought it back to eat. And it had, obviously been lagging far behind this kind of wagon train, so they didn't think that would be such an affront. But the owner of the cow was just incensed and went straight to the agent at Pine Ridge and, demanded retribution. And so that got Colonel Grattan and his men all fired up, and they said they were going to, exact revenge. So they all rode into Conquering Bear's camp and demanded that the person who had shot the cow be turned over to them for their form of justice. And Conquering Bear, in the typical Lakota way, went and picked out two of the finest ponies from their herd and offered them as a replacement for the sick old cow. But that wasn't going to be enough. They didn't recognize that as appeasement for what they felt needed to be avenged. So they kept at it, and then Conquering Bear said, I will speak to the young man, but it's up to him if he wants to turn himself in. And they weren't having that, and words got a little bit more fiery, and pretty soon a soldier or two just started firing shots, and they shot Conquering Bear, the leader, and other people who happened to be around, whether they were women, children, or men, which obviously started a retribution there, and the Lakota warriors killed Grattan and all of his men. In the case of Fetterman, same kind of hubris. He also had said that he would wipe out all the Sioux people. And that fight was really kind of remarkable from a historical perspective, because that's where we really can read about the kind of exploits that Crazy Horse did as a decoy. So one of the best things he could do would be to lead these the people pursuing, in mad pursuit. He would lead them closer and closer to where they would finally be surrounded by warriors, and they never seemed to catch on to that. So he would either fake an injury, he would have his pony limp, or he would pretend that he fell off and then start running alongside his pony. Meanwhile, all of these arrows and bullets are shooting everywhere around him, and he's never hit. And he leads Fetterman and his men into an ambush where every one of them was wiped out as well. It's called it used to be called the Fetterman Massacre. It's now called the Fetterman Fight because it was obviously a defensive battle that the Lakotas were engaged in. So he also showed courage in every time he would ride into battle. One of the things that he would shout, and then everyone behind him would shout back, is "Okahe," which means it's a good day to die. And that doesn't mean that he was hoping or wishing to die, but just that the ultimate sacrifice is in giving your life for the people. Many cultures share that as a warrior, you are ready to sacrifice your life. And so he went into battle in that way, fearless of his own demise. Much like how the buffalo turns and faces a storm head on, a blizzard, that's the way Lakota warriors and especially Crazy Horse would face a battle absolutely head on. That's the similarities between the people and the buffalo is probably one of the reasons why they're called the Buffalo Nation to this day. Chante Washake is strength of mind and heart. We certainly know that he underwent many challenges leading up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the defeat of Custer. And sometimes they were, actually in battle when they would lose a lot of men. He lost friends in these altercations, but also it was during long periods of just contemplation and reflection in terms of what would be the best way to lead his people during these times of encroachment by the military and by Euro-American settlers who were making their way in bigger and bigger numbers towards the west. Joseph Marshall says that fortitude is grandmother's road, meaning that even the strongest warrior can learn something from the strength of the women. They say that that a tribe or a community is not defeated until the hearts of its women are on the ground. So Joseph Marshall says, we Lakota still have a strong culture because our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents persisted in quiet little ways, thereby preserving the essence of who and what we are through the same fortitude that brought victory at the Little Bighorn. So Marshall equates fortitude as seen in the women and also in terms of the warriors. By the way, it was not common, but it was not unheard of for women to be warriors. And that was generally well respected and received by the entire community. It came with more than just a woman wanting to hunt with the men or go to war with the men, but it was also a clear sort of rejection of traditional female roles within the community, and that was certainly not looked down upon or discouraged. But again, it was not that common. Some stories do recount that it was actually a woman who mortally wounded Custer at the Little Bighorn, but some of those stories vary a little bit in terms of details. And this is just an aside, but I guess the counterpart to a woman warrior in Lakota culture was what is called a winkte, which was a man who decided to take on the role and responsibilities of a woman in Lakota culture. Again, not discouraged at all, not altogether common, but probably a little bit more common than the opposite. So they dressed like women. They took on many of the roles of cooking and moving the lodges and things like that. They were very revered, actually considered holy people. Two spirits, they were called also. And one of the most important jobs they had was whenever a war party would be coming back to camp, the winkte was the one who went out before they sort of breached the perimeter of the camp in order to reconcile any deaths that had occurred during war. So especially when they were going to war against the Pawnee or the Crow, if they took life, that was considered a very serious matter, and it had to be resolved and balance kind of restored before the warriors could kind of breach back into the community again. And that was the job of a winkte or two-spirit, to sort of negotiate back into balance. The other way is probably the saddest way he showed fortitude, and that was the death of his daughter. So they are afraid of her was her name, and by all accounts he adored his daughter, was close to her, and although his whole life had been kind of periods of removing himself from the community and going off alone. Some people say he was very lonely. Others say he sought to be alone often, and his daughter would miss him when he would go, but he would always come back with something for her and just really doted on her. Unfortunately, she caught the coughing sickness that so many people caught, a newly introduced white man's disease, and she died at a very young age. The other quality or virtue or principle that he had was wokshape, which is wisdom, and the wisdom to understand what is right. So after the Fetterman fight and other exploits that Crazy Horse had proven himself to be such a good protector of the people, some of the elders got together and decided to revive kind of a traditional custom of bestowing shirts on the bravest of the brave. And these shirt wearers were then to be thought of as the leaders, not just in times of war, but also in terms of what is the best route for the people going forward and things like that. So the people weren't necessarily surprised when young men like American Horse and He Dog were nominated and given these shirts by the elders, who basically rode from one lodge to the next and called out the warrior and then bestowed the shirt. But it was kind of a surprise that Crazy Horse was chosen, not because he wasn't brave and very wise, but because he wasn't really from a prominent family, like He Dog and American Horse. His father, Crazy Horse's father, was actually called an interpreter, Yeshka, which is someone who both interprets dreams and also functions as an intermediary between this world and the spirit world for the people. But they say the cheers were the loudest for Crazy Horse, and the shirts are made from the skin of bighorn sheep, and the shirts are decorated to coincide with something very personal about the particular warrior who wears it. It's interesting, later these shirts were also incorporated into the ghost dance, and the people would wear these shirts when they were doing the ghost dance, which we'll be talking about as we wrap up Lakota culture next week. So Crazy Horse and the other Lakota leaders were under incredible pressure to surrender and bring their people into Fort Robinson. They were promised rations, which we will see were not delivered. And they were promised, a peaceful, if they surrendered peacefully, that the soldiers would take them in peacefully and provide rations for the people. But before we get to what happened, Crazy Horse did meet his end at Fort Robinson. But it's important to understand in terms of what his vision was and how his vision guided him from the time he had it until the very last day of his life, and how many of the images from his vision actually did manifest in this world. So again, Crazy Horse was born, I think around 1850, in an area in the Black Hills. The Black Hills were always very, very important to him. He spent a lot of time in solitude. And it's believed that he had his vision at Bear Butte in the Black Hills. But as I said, when he was very young, he was known to be curious about becoming a very good warrior. And so he sought out a mentor, a few years older than him, High Backbone, who became his lifelong mentor, made him his first bow, and accompanied him in battle almost till the very end, and who also displayed a lot of those virtues, modesty, humility, and generosity that Crazy Horse also embodied. So we know his first kind of experience with the viciousness of the white soldiers was when he witnessed the shooting and then the death of Conquering Bear. And that put permanent hatred in his heart when he saw that not just Conquering Bear, but the people, women and children around him, had also been taken out by the soldiers. It instilled in him a lifelong hatred for the United States military. It wasn't until about 2 months after the death of Conquering Bear and the Lakotas had killed all of him and all of his men, that General Harney, who actually Harney's Peak used to be called Harney's Peak in the Black Hills, it's now Black Elk Peak, was named after. But he took revenge on the camp of Little Thunder that had nothing to do with what happened with the cow and the Mormons and all of that. but he went, General Harney, and he took out an entire Lakota camp. Everybody was slaughtered, basically. And Crazy Horse had been out solitary on a hunting trip and came across that camp. The only survivor he found was a young woman with her dead baby who had been shot. And her name was Yellow Woman. She was from the Cheyenne tribe. And he basically saved her, brought her back to her people, and became, it's kind of unclear what the nature of that relationship was, but became very close within that Cheyenne community, very close to her father, Ice, who was Wachajawakan, a medicine man, and continued to be very loyal and take care of Yellow Woman until her death. But he did have his vision shortly after that, again in a time when he had gone away on his own. Vision quest requires at least 4 days and 4 nights out, far from other people, no food, no water, and just seeking a vision, Hamblachea, from the spirit world. And he did receive one. It starts with a still lake, and then all of a sudden a horse with a rider comes out of the lake and begins running. The horse, as it's running, changes color from red to white to black to yellow as it's running. And it's the rider, too, that kind of is a very major part of this vision. The rider is dressed in just a breechcloth and then has painted hailstones and lightning on his torso. He's wearing one single feather and has a stone tied in his hair behind his ear. As the horse and the rider are running, their arms reaching up to pull him off the horse, and in the vision he recognizes those people as his own people, trying to pull him off the horse. That's a really critical part of the vision, because that does actually happen in this world, or in his life. Oh, and there's a hawk as the horse and rider are running. There's a hawk flying over them and guiding them, which is why rather than wear a headdress with eagle feathers, he always wore a single hawk feather when going into battle. He tells his father, who's the interpreter, and Gigi is then given his father's name, Crazy Horse, and named a Thunder Dreamer. What is so remarkable and just shows the generosity of the community and his father is in giving him this name that has been passed down for generations. He then gives himself the most insignificant name in order to make way for his father. And the translation for the name he gave was worm, like a worm on the ground, like almost insignificant. When he was younger, he kind of fell in love with Black Buffalo Woman. She was the niece of Red Cloud, who was a very important Lakota leader, almost like a chief. The way of courting would be to go to a young woman's lodge, and she would come out, and then the boy would wrap the blanket around both of them so that of course, they were being supervised by the grandmothers the entire time, but they could at least talk in private. But for Black Buffalo Woman, she was very popular, so he had to wait his turn. There were many, many suitors that would line up outside her lodge for years. But over time, it seemed that she began to favor Crazy Horse, and everyone seemed to kind of assume that eventually, they would become husband and wife. But that was not to happen on a hunting trip. This group, he was with a group of other hunters. They were heading out, and one of them, a young man named No Water, stopped and said he had a toothache and that he couldn't go. And because they knew that his medicine was the bear, and he wore bear's teeth around his neck, they believed him, and they thought that significant enough. And so they went on without him. And weeks later, when they returned after a successful hunt, he was told that No Water had gone back and claimed Black Buffalo Woman as his wife, which was the first of a couple very, very traumatic incidences in Crazy Horse's life. And it seemed that he really withdrew after that for a long time. But after a couple of years, he did go and visit Black Buffalo Woman again, and they would kind of resume their very, very strong friendship, much to the jealousy of No Water, her husband. Now, in traditional Lakota culture, a woman has the right to leave a marriage for whatever reason. All she has to do is put her husband's belongings outside the lodge, since the lodge is hers. And she can also leave if she chooses to for absolutely no reason, and there's no prohibition against that. So one morning when the camp woke up, they discovered that Crazy Horse and Black Buffalo Woman had taken off with a couple of their friends, High Backbone for him and one of her friends, and they had left and were going to live as husband and wife. But No Water found them, chased them down and found them, and for the first time ever, and only until his death, Crazy Horse was wounded because No Water shot him, and he almost died. He was carried back and kind of cared for and nursed back to health by his own people. And so that was kind of the realization of the first part of his vision, where his own people are trying to kill him or hurt him badly. So that was the first time when he was shot by No Water, and never did get to be with Black Buffalo Woman. So one of the saddest things about his life. As I mentioned, he had had really strong ties to the Cheyenne community, and there was an incident with I think it was Colonel Shivington, who had these famous quotes like "nits make lice," which was his way of telling his men if they came across any community of American Indians to get rid of them all, including the children, because nits make lice. So just a horrible guy. He lured Black Kettle and a group of peaceful Cheyennes to Sand Creek, which is in what is now Colorado, and told them that they would be safe if they surrendered. So they came and they put up a white flag in the middle of their village. And then from a hill up above them with all of his men, he rode into Sand Creek and massacred the entire village of men, women, and children, peaceful. And that, again, really solidified Crazy Horse's loyalty and his need for revenge against the military. So yeah, he became a shirt wearer and led many incursions against the cavalry and others. So we talked about the Fetterman fight, or I talked about it. He also led raids into the Black Hills after Custer obviously violated the treaty. A lot of miners would go in, and Crazy Horse would find them and take them out, kill them in the Black Hills. All of that led to this confrontation at the Little Bighorn, which is, it goes into much more detail with the documentary Tushunka but doesn't seem like Custer knew how big that camp was. It was during Sundance, and there were at least 3,000 people camped there. So when he rode in fast and furious, and then was tricked, by Crazy Horse into riding up a hill where he was then surrounded with his men, he clearly didn't realize what he was up against. So again, Black Shawl was his actual wife, Crazy Horse's wife, and by all accounts, she was the one who gave birth to They Are Afraid of Her, his daughter. And by all accounts, she was a very, very good wife to him, took good care of him when he was there, and also understood those periods where he would go off by himself for, sometimes weeks at a time. She also got the coughing sickness and was really, really sick leading up to the Little Bighorn. So Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were probably the last of the great, what the military called the hostiles. They stayed out of the forts as long as they possibly could until I think the winter of 1876 or 77, when the winter was so bad that the people almost died, and Crazy Horse really had to stop, pause, and rethink whether or not he should surrender. At that point, the Black Hills had been, completely invaded for the gold rush. And basically the government put out, the sell or starve policy, where they basically told all Lakota warriors or leaders, sell us the Black Hills or we will cut off all of the rations that were promised in the treaty. Not that they ever upheld those conditions to any great extent, but this was one of those just, where you sort of drop the hammer manifestos, and that's what the pressure was for Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull at that time. So, like I said, Crazy Horse did meet his death at Fort Robinson after the winter of 76 and so many people dying of starvation. He did agree to surrender and was told by the agent and the head of the military that if he did surrender peacefully, that they would not be hostile. They would welcome the people in there and feed them and make them warm and all of that. But so he was riding ahead of the people. And as he rode in, he noticed one of his childhood friends who had actually turned against the Lakotas and was now part of the military, rode out to meet him and with some others. And when they got to him, they pulled him off of his horse and handcuffed him. And they were leading him into, if you go to Fort Robinson, it's in Nebraska, you can see what they were trying to lead him into was like a small little jailhouse in the middle of the fort. And as they were trying to pull him towards there, he started to fight them and was pulling back. And it was his friend, Little Big Man, who actually grabbed him from behind, grabbed his arms. And as he held him like that, a soldier stabbed him like right under the ribs with a bayonet, which would be a horrible way to go. It did take him all night in a very excruciating way to finally die. But before he died, his parents were there at the fort, and he asked them to bury his heart at Wounded Knee. So we've talked a little bit about Wounded Knee, and I'm going to upload a documentary for us about Wounded Knee and its significance for the Lakota culture. But the next morning, before dawn, his mother and father took off with a wagon with his body, and no one's quite sure where they went. But most Lakotas today, and especially the descendants of the Tioshpaye, Fire Lightning Tioshpaye, who still live there, say that his heart is buried at Wounded Knee. So that's my presentation for Crazy Horse. And like I said, next week we're going to wrap up Lakota culture with a look at the Sioux Uprising, the Ghost Dance, and what happened at Wounded Knee in 1890.